Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining in this afternoon for our webinar releasing some results from a couple of recent, a poll and a survey that was done of both potential jurors in Texas as well as of the attorneys in the state. I want to start by thanking our two panelists who will be speaking most of the time with you today, both Jesse Rutledge, who is the Vice President of External Affairs for the National Center for State Courts in Williamsburg, Virginia, and Carl Agnew, who is with GBAO Strategies, the pollster. He and Jesse will be talking about the results from the Texas poll, as well as talking to you a little bit about the results from the national poll and the comparison there. At the end, I'm going to speak to you a little bit about the survey result that came from the I don't know what's going on here. That came from the Texas Attorney Survey. So we'll get that information out to you today as well. And I'd like to start by thanking the National Center for State Courts was looking at doing this poll nationally, and the Jury Service Task Force that we've put together here in Texas really wanted some of the similar data in Texas. And so we reached out, and the Texabota was generous enough to fund the survey. So I'd like to just thank them for doing that work. So we're grateful to Texabota. But without any further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Jesse and let you lead the discussion about kind of the results and kind of where you and Carl. Jesse?
Thank you, David. Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to be with you this afternoon. To have the opportunity to walk through some of these fascinating survey findings. And I echo David's thanks to Texabota for making this feasible financially. This afternoon, we're going to look at results first from a statewide public opinion poll of registered voters in Texas. We have a lot of data to share. We have a limited amount of time. We also know that you're going to have a lot of questions. So we're going to try to be expeditious as we go through the key findings. Before we do that, I want to briefly introduce my colleague, Carl Agnew. Actually, I'm going to have Carl introduce himself. Why don't you say hi, Carl?
Hello. Carl Agnew, partner with GBAO, as David said, and we've been doing polling with the National Center for State Courts for about 8 years on a range of issues related to operations of state courts and public opinion, and happy to be here. Thank you.
Wonderful. So we will focus the first portion of our conversation on the results from the voter opinion poll. And we'll get started right off the bat by talking a little bit about the methodology, which is very important in understanding how the survey work was done and what it means. As you can see on this first slide, there were 850 eligible Texas jurors who were interviewed for this survey. The survey was conducted earlier this month. We're going to talk a bit about that, when that happened and what that means in just a moment. And you can see that the survey was conducted by a combination of landline telephone, cell phone, and online interviews, mixed mode, so to speak. Margin of error of a little over 3 percentage points. Carl, you're the survey expert here. Why don't you take a moment to explain what the concept of margin of error means, so people know how that fits.
Sure. So taking folks back to high school or college statistics courses you might have taken, our goal here is to replicate our larger universe as much as possible without actually having to talk to all of them. So to get a representative sample that is representative geographically, demographically, and ideologically as best we can. And we did that with the 850 folks we talked to. We started with the universe of registered voters, but then we also added folks who weren't registered voters, who were also driver ID holders or state ID holders. Doing the best we can to replicate the larger jury pool across the state. And as I said, we got a representative sampling, and the idea behind margin of error, of course, is that by getting that representative sampling, you don't have to talk to everyone, and the results you get will be identical to what you would have gotten if you talked to everyone within that margin of error, plus or minus 3 points. So pretty close, and I think some of the trends in here are so clear and so consistent that they really, increase our confidence even more. Not worrying about that plus or minus 3 points. The overwhelming direction of the research is very clear.
And you'll see at a couple of points as we walk through the findings, the comparisons to the national data sort of emphasize that point. There's a lot of similarity in the data, whether it was in the Texas specific data or the national survey data. So without holding off any further, let's get into some of the key findings from this survey work.
Can I stop you for just 1 second? I forgot one thing I was going to mention, which is we do have the Q&A box open. So those of you that are actually on the webinar, at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box. You can submit your questions there. And if you, at the end, we will do our best to answer all those questions. So that's where you would put those. Thanks. Go ahead, Jesse. Thank you.
So key findings from this Texas survey that amidst a pandemic, Texans are hesitant to resume regular activities. Probably not a big surprise. People are looking for alternatives to reporting to the brick and mortar courthouse. We also find that there's a particular challenge with seniors, those over 65. They present the greatest challenge in terms of getting them out for jury service because they are as uncomfortable with going to a courthouse as they are with accessing the remote technology that they would need to participate remotely. All of this leads us in the direction of the big challenge. The composition of the jury pool is likely to present an ongoing challenge, regardless of whether that's an in-person environment or a virtual environment. I mentioned at the outset that I wanted to talk a bit about the timing of this survey. The interviews were conducted between June 8th and 11th. And you can see from this slide where that week, those 4 days fit relative to a series of the major national events that have been taking place over the last month or so. It's been a very busy month. It was very difficult to find a time where we could conduct this survey in the field without it running up against other major events. I think we got somewhat lucky in that the week that we did it might have been one of the quieter weeks. Then as you can see from the slide here, lots of other things that might have pushed into people's minds as they were answering these questions. So that's a little bit of context for when the survey work was done. Let's start with some basic questions about the attitudes of Texans towards their state court system. Right off the bat, you can see that there is a fairly large racial divide in the views of Texans on the job performance of the Texas state court system. Carl, why don't you tell us a bit about what we're looking at here?
Sure. So a couple of points of reference here. So first, you see overall, Texans are pretty split on the performance of the state courts overall. 50% saying that they're doing an excellent or good job, 49% only fair or poor. It's a little bit better than the national numbers, which you see at the bottom there at 46-51. But underneath, you see that there are huge racial differences here. And we're going to explore differences by a variety of demographics. But on this one, race is really the most important variable. And you see white Texans giving a 62% favorable opinion of the performance of the courts, Hispanic 44%, and African Americans all the way down there at 14%. So a dramatic gap and drop off, particularly among the African American audience. And you see circled there on the right, what I think is really important is 41% giving it a poor, the lowest possible rating. So it's not a soft negative, it's a hard negative, if you will. A lot of intensity behind the negativity that African Americans are feeling toward the courts right now. And so I think it's really important for those within the courts just to understand some of the nuances and the distinctions here.
So moving on to the next slide, I think the story is very much similar in other areas. This slide is about confidence in other institutions, including the court system. What do you take away from this one, Carl?
Well, a couple things. First of all, overall, high confidence expressed across the board in all these institutions. You can see some of the racial differences, and they are similar. But again, as the box on the right points out, the drop off from white and Hispanic to the African American audience is larger with the courts than it is with any of the other audiences. So it's really just important to understand that dynamic. So less confidence across the board within the African American community, but it's particularly focused on the courts. But overall, when you look at the population as a whole, we see broad confidence, not a huge amount of those saying they have a great deal of confidence, more in that soft confidence when it comes to the court system, something that they don't think about every day and that we know from previous research. Most Americans and most Texans don't have really strong feelings about the courts because it's not something that they focus on a daily basis.
So given what's been happening across the country for the last few weeks, viewers might be a little bit surprised by the top bar there, the confidence at 81% in local police department. Are you surprised by that number?
So I'm not terribly surprised by it because the analogy that I always use is when we're talking about Congress. People across this country give Congress about an 11 to 13% approval rating, but incumbent members of Congress get reelected at overwhelming numbers. And so while they don't like Congress, they like their own member of Congress significantly better. And while there's a lot of questions about police being asked on a broad sense, when we talk about your local police department, we see consistently higher marks. And while they have questions about police violence in general, when it comes to their own police department, they're much more willing to give them the benefit of the doubt.
Right. So let's move on from the big picture kind of confidence in institutions questions into the real purpose of this survey, which was to better understand the respondents' views on concerns they have about how the pandemic has impacted their ability to do various things in life, and from our perspective, how it's impacted their ability to participate as potential jurors. Right out of the gates, one of the questions that we asked at the start of the survey was to have people tell us their personal direct experience with COVID, who had tested positive, who had tested negative, who had experienced symptoms consistent with coronavirus but hadn't been tested. And you can see the vast majority of respondents, 84%, saying that they had not experienced symptoms and had not been tested. So I think that's fairly consistent with the national numbers we saw in this same survey, and fairly consistent with what we're seeing around the country. Am I right about that?
Very much so. In the national, the percent tested was just about the same. Those who said they'd experienced symptoms but not been tested was a little bit higher, but overall very consistent. Okay.
So we also asked them to tell us whether any of a certain set of situations would apply to them in their personal lives. Do they have someone in their household with an underlying health condition that might cause concern for them to go into a situation where they'd be around a lot of other people, potentially contract the virus and bring it home? And you can see that 45% of the respondents said that they have somebody in their house who has that sort of underlying health condition. We asked whether or not they might be a primary caregiver to an elderly family member. About 14%, so right around 1 in 7 of our respondents said that they had that in their personal situation. And then we asked those who reported having minor children whether they could secure childcare for their kids if they had to be away from home for an extended period of time, if they got called to a courthouse for jury service. So you can take a look at the numbers there on the left. And then the bottom line is that across the entire sample of respondents, over half, 52%, cited one or more of these obstacles to reporting for jury service. Carl, tell us a bit about what the demographics of that 52% look like.
Sure. So first, I just want to point out, the disparity between these first two graphs that we've looked at. While only 1% have tested positive, the impact of pandemic on the emotional and mental health is much greater than it has been on physical health. And that's what this slide is really bringing to light. Over half say that they face one of these obstacles would make it very difficult for them to go out. And as we're going to talk about a little later, makes them much more hesitant to engage in a number of activities, including going to the courthouse. But those, again, over half of the entire population says they face at least one of these obstacles. But those numbers are much higher among women, who are much more likely to be facing the bulk of the caregiver duties, whether it's for elderly family members or children. Older folks who are facing greater health problems of their own and greater health challenges for others in their household, and communities of color, who also are facing a disproportionate impact from the disease and disproportionate impact from some of the health factors correlated with it. So those are the groups that are most impacted. Conversely, younger and male groups are the ones who are least likely to be impacted. And so obviously the implications for that for the jury pool are pretty clear, and we'll get into those in a little more detail later.
Right. Okay. So we also wanted to gauge people's comfort levels with engaging in certain activities. And we asked our respondents to rate on a scale from 1 to 10, where 10 was very comfortable and 0 to 10, where 0 was completely uncomfortable and 10 was completely comfortable with doing any of the following activities that you see up on this particular slide. And you can see that the numbers range from a high of 7.4 for going to a friend or a family member's home, down to the bottom there, which is perhaps not surprisingly, serving on a jury if selected. The average rating was 5.2, and we had 53% of our respondents who scored this at 5 or below. In between there, you've got some interesting variations in that people are still, I'd say, relatively comfortable with going to a polling place to vote, which I think is interesting given the fact that there's been a great deal in the news over the last several weeks about issues that certain states have had with conducting elections, whether it's Georgia, Wisconsin, of course, yesterday, I think it was Kentucky and a few other states. There's been a lot in the media about that. And you can see that's right below that, going to a government office gets a 6. Interestingly to me, beneath all that, eating out in a restaurant, something that I think people are probably pretty eager to return to, still ranks in towards the bottom of the scale. So Carl, is there anything notable about how people responded to this question in your mind?
A couple of things I think are most notable. First, reporting for jury duty and serving on a jury were the only two where a majority of folks did rate it 0 to 5, where they indicated that they would not be comfortable. So I think that's very important to understand. Second, I think we have to look at this in context and understand that there is a little bit of self-selection here involved. Going to a polling place to vote is a civic duty. Reporting for jury duty is a civic duty, but there's probably a little bit more satisfaction and self-affirmation in the former than the latter. So I think, a little bit of the difference between going to a government office and reporting to your local courthouse has to do with the desirability of jury duty itself and how a lot of people look at it as an onerous task. So I think we have to understand that when we talk about attitudes toward it, a lot of it, I would say the majority of it, is pandemic driven, but some of that drop off is also contributed to the nature of jury duty itself and the hesitance that a lot of folks feel toward that service.
Very good. So what we're really talking about here are, comfort levels, people's comfort levels. And I think one of the takeaways from the survey as a whole is that there's a fair amount of anxiety, a fair amount of discomfort with doing certain things. Why don't you give us some more insight into folks' comfort levels, Carl?
Sure. So similar to the one where we talked about obstacles, there's significant demographic differences. When we look at those who ranked it, and this is actually based on 0 to 4 on that scale. So really the negative end and the lowest ratings on that 0 to 10 scale, 39% overall said that they would not be comfortable with reporting for jury activities or going to a government building. But the individuals who are least comfortable, you see in that box there, significantly higher. There's an ideological piece here with those who self-identify as liberals, most likely to say they would not be comfortable. African Americans, as you can see, college-educated groups, particularly college-educated women, and then those high-risk households we talked about, those who are facing the obstacles, older women who again make up a disproportionate amount of those who are facing the obstacles, and seniors who also make up a disproportionate amount. So there's those who face the risks, and then those who are just temperamentally less inclined to report.
All right, we're going to move forward now and talk a bit about another of the major issues that we were able to pull some information out from this survey. Issues related to technology access and issues around the so-called digital divide. So we asked our respondents to tell us what sort of technology they had. What do they have access to at their homes and in their lives? And as you can see from this slide right here, we've got very impressive numbers of people who are reporting that they have access to the sorts of technology that they would need to conduct business remotely. So 88% indicating that they subscribe to the internet at home, including 84% who characterize their service as high speed, an amazing 97% who report owning a cell phone, including 90% who tell us that that cell phone is actually a smartphone capable of doing things other than making phone calls and sending old-fashioned text messages. And when you look at the sample overall and you ask the question, who has neither internet at home nor a cell phone, you get less than 1% of the respondents. So big picture, that's sort of telling one story, but I think we probably want to be careful about the conclusions that we draw from that. And I think the next slide explains what those caveats are. So Carl, why don't you take this one and tell us a bit about what you might see as some of the limitations of assuming that, you know, everybody's got the access they need.
Sure. So I think the most important thing is that we're relying on self-reporting here. And when we ask folks, you know, do you have high-speed internet access? That means different things to different people. So while a lot of us who work in professional areas are used to high-speed broadband and have, you know, a clear definition, those who live in rural areas have never really consistently had that kind of access. For many of them who don't have it in a professional setting, they have, you know, less reliable cell service, and so their definition of high speed is different than what some of those who live in large metropolitan areas or have greater access to it in residential areas might be thinking. So I think we have to, you know, understand that part of this is self-reporting. But clearly, overall access technology is very high when it comes to those individuals who are in the jury pool. But there's a question that we get to a little bit later where we talk about what devices they would use if they were interacting remotely, and nearly half say they would rely on their cell phone. So we asked this question about wireless service and what they have, and you can see 78% say that they have unlimited minutes, 77% have unlimited data, 67% have both, but that means 1 out of 3 do not have at least one of those. And if they're going to be participating, that could have clear implications in terms of the time that they're going to potentially be asked to spend connected to jury proceedings or other remote proceedings. So 11%, as you can see, report that they have neither of these. And that number is significantly higher. Again, we're thinking about who are the groups who are left out as we contemplate this. A lot of groups are in, and we see large majorities on most of these questions, but 25% of seniors, 26% of seniors, and 23% of those earning less than $50,000 a year have neither of these features and are going to be much more severely constrained if they're asked to participate remotely, particularly via cell phone.
So
I should point out that all of this is connected to what they have at home. You know, with most folks not reporting to work, we're not asking what kind of access people have at work. We're reporting only what they have at home. I just wanted to point that out.
Sure, of course. So many who are watching this are probably aware of the fact that Texas has emerged as the national leader on the use of video conferencing to conduct remote court hearings over the last couple of months, and I've lost track of the numbers of thousands of hours that David Slayton's office has reported conducting. It's phenomenal. Let's talk a bit about video conferencing technologies and comfort levels and access that that people have reported. So on this slide, we get a quick look at the big picture here, and you can see that that there are, again, some significant age differences. Carl, how would you characterize attitudes towards video conferencing by age?
I think this is where we really start to see some of the biggest differences emerging, and age is the most important variable. Everyone has probably seen some press reports about increased use of Zoom and other video conferencing technologies. It's obviously exploded over the last 3 months, and over half of those in the jury pool say that they have at least regularly used it in the last 3 months. But the number, again, is significantly driven by age. 65% of those under 50 down to all the way 33% of seniors, and those 50 to 64 very much in the middle. So the current usage is about half and half, a little over half. Those who say that they'd be willing to or think that they could be comfortable with the technology is higher. So there are folks who aren't using it but figure they can figure it out. And that jump is pretty consistent with those under 65, but not much at all in terms of those over 65. So even when you're asking, would you be comfortable trying it, a plurality of those 65 plus say they would not. So a real difference. Those under 50, very comfortable with technology, much more conversant in it, much more likely, even if they're not currently conversant in it, to figure they can figure it out. But once you get over age 50, the confidence and the comfort levels decrease significantly.
So on the next slide, we're getting a perspective of what people tell us they would use if they were going to be participating in remote jury service. What do we take away from the breakdown here?
So a couple of things. First, we allowed people to pick more than one device if that was how they felt that they would interact, and as you can see, a number did. Laptop computer, probably the easiest, along with desktop computer, and the most versatile for the purposes of those at the courts. But nearly half said that they would use a smartphone part or all of the time if they were asked to serve remotely. And I think that has clear implications and potential limitations for how they could participate and what it would mean in terms of the courts and the information they'd have to provide in formats and such if people are reliant completely upon a smartphone. So I think that was the most important piece coming out of this, and tablets obviously down there at the bottom, the least likely to be used.
This slide makes me think a little bit of the trial, trial that Judge Miskell helped run, where she had the smartphone up and she kept rotating around trying to get the juror to be able to see things properly. All right, so let's move to this next slide. And again, we're sort of getting into, I guess, some of the limitations perhaps. And on this question, we asked people about their ability to be in a quiet place in their home for an extended period of time. There are some challenges here. I think the finding is that 63% of the respondents said that they would have the ability to isolate themselves in a quiet place in their home for up to 8 hours to participate in remote jury service. But that's not everybody. Obviously, you've got a little more than a third of respondents who said they probably couldn't do that. What do those 35 or 40% of the respondents look like?
Yeah, so we threw this in with the technology questions because it deals with a related issue. And that is obviously if folks are going to be engaged remotely, are they going to be able to focus on what's going on? And we found more than 1 in 3 saying that they would not be able to. And that number particularly high, and I think this is pretty logical, but lower income audiences and moms. They're the two groups that edged much more closer to 50%, saying that they would not be able to isolate themselves for a significant amount of time at home if required in order to focus on remote proceedings.
Great. So this has been a lot of information about remote proceedings. We're going to turn next to talking a bit about in-person jury participation and see what some of the challenges look like there according to our respondents. So the conclusion here is that approximately a third of Texans say that they would not appear for jury duty if they were summoned in the next 3 months. And that figure is slightly higher than the same question asked of our national sample. Is there anything else to point out here, Carl?
Well, I think looking at it in context, one, the fact that Texas is a little lower. Two, looking at the exact wording of the question, we put it in the context of receiving a summons. So that it wasn't if you were politely asked, it's if you received a summons for jury duty. And still only 60% say that they would be likely to appear. But also, I think timing is an important factor here. This came out of the field on June 11th. A lot's happened since June 11th that leads us to believe that this number, if anything, has probably gone down since then in the state of Texas specifically. So we would look, I would look at 60% as kind of a high water mark at this point and think that there's good reason to think it's probably a little bit lower today than it was when the survey was conducted just less than 2 weeks ago.
So a little more detail on this same issue in terms of who is likely to appear and who is likely to not appear. Why don't you walk us through how this breaks down demographically, again, according to what our respondents self-reported?
Yeah, so we asked these folks how likely they would be to appear, and this is based on self-reporting, and it's not 100% one way or the other. But the groups who say that they would be most likely to appear, and where we see the greatest lack of resistance, is white men, younger white folks overall, young men, and self-identified conservatives. On the other hand, those groups who are least likely to appear, and then this is from least likely to more likely, women of color, so women both African American and Hispanic. We didn't have a large enough sample of Asian Americans to break that down demographically, but African American women and Hispanic women least likely to report that they would appear if summoned. Older African Americans or Hispanics, also significant amounts of hesitation there. There was a real drop off in the Houston area. We looked at the Houston media market, so not just the city, but the surrounding areas as well. The Houston media market had significantly lower numbers than the rest of the state, really. I thought that was noteworthy, and I'm not sure exactly what's driving that. Obviously, Houston is a highly diverse area, and some of the racial and ethnic dynamics are going to play a role there. But I thought that was also worth considering. And then older women, seniors, some of the groups that we talked about facing the greatest obstacles are also the least likely to say that they would actually appear.
Yeah, so just to go back to the Houston issue for a moment, is that the only particular urban area where you saw this sort of stand out? There weren't any other major cities in the state that had sort of similar reactions?
So Texas is obviously a huge state with a lot of areas, and so we don't have large enough base sizes in all of them. But we did look at Austin, San Antonio, Dallas, Houston, and then the rural areas separately. And Houston was clearly the lowest out of all of the rural areas, also with lower rates. But the drop off was larger in Houston than anywhere else.
And again, just to emphasize, the survey was completed 13 days ago now, and I think we're all aware of the fact that the situation has probably changed quite a bit in the last 13 days in Texas. So keep that in mind. All right, so moving forward to the next slide, we wanted to visit with people about whether there were things that the state courts could do that would make them feel more comfortable if they were to be called for jury service. And we gave them sort of we gave them a list of things that that courts could do and asked them to tell us whether, if that thing was done, they would be more comfortable in reporting for jury service. The top finding is 74% would feel more comfortable if they knew that the temperatures of all prospective jurors would be checked and that anyone with a fever would be sent home. The second highest ranked comfort measure was basically around immediate testing, which I think we all know is probably not realistic. I'm not sure anybody is familiar with a test that can return results quickly, but that is something that, were it to be developed, would also add a level of comfort for potential jurors. And then there are a variety of other measures that all of which I think made some difference. Anything else you want to add onto this slide, Carl?
Sorry, in thinking about whether or not folks are it's actually going to make a difference, I was really most focused on the much more comfortable bar, the dark shaded piece that you see there, and that's why we really focused on those two, because there was a significant separation from all the other measures and those top two, the testing and the temperature checks, the immediate feedback, and the ability to identify those who pose the greatest risk to others. I think is what really matters the most to folks, and the most powerful reassurance that the courts can communicate to folks that they're taking steps. As we talked about, actual coronavirus testing may not be feasible at this point. Hopefully at some point it will be, but right now it's not. But temperature checks is at least something that can be done. I won't get into the cost and logistical implications of that for individual courts. I'll leave that for them to figure out, but it is something at least that can be done. And I think, suggesting that the bottom five probably in a lot of ways for most potential jurors represent their expectation of what the court should be doing. And the top two represent extra steps that could be taken to really send a message that the courthouse is doing everything possible to look out for the health and safety of everyone who enters it.
Let's talk a bit about one specific measure, which is face masks. And we asked our respondents to tell us their position on whether face masks should be required to enter a courthouse, should be encouraged but not required, or that there shouldn't be any rules about wearing masks in the courthouse. And you can see that 68% of the respondents in the Texas sample told us that they should be required, dwarfing the other two groups, 16% who thought that they should be encouraged but not required, 13% saying no masks, no rules. These stack up almost exactly to the figures from the overall national sample. which are shown over there on the right, 67, 16, and 13. The difference being, I am assuming, a rounding issue somewhere in the data. Carl, what do you take away from this overwhelming call for face masks in courthouses?
So when we're designing a survey, we always have more questions than we can fit in, and we have to make choices. And I encourage not asking the mask question, because my firm has done so many surveys over the last 3 months all over the country, and these numbers are so consistent and so overwhelmingly in support of face masks. And I was like, we know the answer to this, guys. And David in particular was like, yeah, but this is Texas. This is going to be different. And I said, well, I don't think so. We'll ask it, and we'll include it. And that's exactly what we do. The consistency here, there's some very I think, unrepresentative coverage of anti-mask voices and anti-mask concerns. But what we've seen in national research and state-by-state research, regional research, everywhere we go, is that the overwhelming majority of folks view masks as a bare minimum and are not comfortable if others are not going to be wearing them wherever they go. And so this number was not terribly surprising to me, but an important one to ask and to really document that sentiment and to note that it's still there. And again, if anything, I would guess that 68 number is even higher now, as the governor has gone on statewide television with a mask and encouraged everyone to wear them, sending a very powerful a very powerful message about how important this variable is.
So I'm keeping an eye on the clock, and I know that we're starting to run short on time. We want to get to questions. So we may move a little more quickly through these last couple of slides before David presents some of the information from the attorney survey. Carl, can you really quickly summarize for us what for those of us who aren't data experts, what the slide refers to?
Sure. So we asked, whether folks would appear or not, and then we introduced all those reassurances, and then we asked again, given this information, would you appear or not? And you see the number jumped from 60% to 68%. Not a huge difference, not a sea change, but that 8-point shift from not appearing to appearing is significant, and the movement came mostly among those groups who were least likely to say that they would move at the beginning, and that was, again, women, particularly African-American and Hispanic women, and kind of self-identified liberals, also Democrats, obviously high correlation there, were the groups most likely to move toward it. Still not as high as younger white men in their stated intention to appear, but the gap narrowed after they heard about those reassurances and got a little bit more of a representative group there.
Great. Let's talk quickly about virtual jury participation and attitudes towards remote participation. And so the takeaway here is that Texans are open to remote participation, but resistance is a little higher amongst the older part of the population. Is that right?
Yeah. So I think most potential jurors don't really know what this looks like. And they're kind of, indicating an openness to it, but still reserving judgment until they have a better idea of exactly what this means. But at least initially, they're open to all of these ideas. Appearing remotely for a case that they have before the court, reporting for jury duty, serving on a jury. They're open to all these ideas. At least two out of three of them are.
So let's compare how people feel if they're given a choice between serving in person or serving remotely, or that is, whether they're more comfortable. Again, I want to emphasize that it's not a prediction about whether they will or will not turn up. It's about how comfortable they're telling us they are doing one of these functions or the other. And so here's the question on the left. It's a detailed question, and we wanted to give you a chance to read the whole thing so you could see what all of our respondents were asked. And you can see that, and again, these numbers for Texas stack up extremely closely to the country as a whole, with just about 2 to 1 people saying that they are more comfortable reporting remotely than they are comfortable reporting in person. However, we've got about 1 out of 3 Texans saying it doesn't make a difference to them. Let's talk quickly about who's inside the more comfortable reporting remotely demographic, Carl.
Consistent with what we've seen in other questions here, again, communities of color, particularly African Americans, most concerned about reporting to the courthouse. So I'm not surprised that they're the ones saying they'd be more comfortable reporting remotely. Those high risk households that we talked about, also well over majority, but also majorities in all of the major media markets that we've looked at: Dallas, Houston, Austin, San Antonio. Majorities in each of them say that they'd be much more comfortable reporting remotely. It's the rural areas, it's the areas outside of those larger metropolitan areas where folks are much more divided on the question. Doesn't mean that they prefer in person, but it's much more of an even split in those areas outside of the 4 largest DMAs.
So finally, and this is the last slide before we turn things over to David for the moment, let's talk a little bit about what we're characterizing as online trial legitimacy. And again, this is a slightly different question from jury service. This is about people's perspectives of if they had their own trial for their own case, how concerned would they be about receiving a fair and impartial trial if the trial was conducted online rather than in person. And you can see the breakdown here, 61% saying they would be concerned, 35% saying that they would not be concerned. What's the context for this, Carl? Because I mean, while it's been big news in the national and Texas judicial community and the Bar Association and so on, this is not necessarily something that people are thinking about in their everyday lives. How does that color people's reaction to this question?
Well, I think we know that they've got a lot of questions about how this would work, but I think that the real value of this slide is putting the previous one in context. They don't view remote juries and remote proceedings as a panacea. They've got a lot of questions, they've got a lot of doubts, but if you ask them, which would you choose, reporting to the courthouse or at least trying this unknown remote, they'll take the unknown over the known risk of reporting to the courthouse. I think that it just kind of reinforces how significant their concerns are, their public health concerns and their personal health concerns are about reporting to the courthouse. So, you know, they've got a lot of questions about the legitimacy, the logistics of online proceedings, but they're willing to roll the dice on that rather than the known risk of reporting to the courthouse, or at least a plurality of them are.
Right. So no real silver bullets here, unfortunately. That concludes the formal presentation on the public opinion survey. I'm going to turn things over to David, and then I think we're going to come back to address as many of the questions in the Q&A box as we can. So David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jesse. Thank you, Carl. Yes, I want to just present to you real quickly from the attorney survey results. So Jesse, if you can move on to the next slide. We, as you probably know, between June 10th and June 17th, OCA, working with the state bar, sent out to all of the attorneys in the state an online survey. We left that open for a week, and we got over 3,700 responses, which basically works out to about a plus or minus 1.6% margin of error based upon our total population. If you go to the next slide, Jesse. So this is a lot of data here, and we could spend a whole webinar probably talking about this, and we'll certainly be issuing a full report. But we went into the survey results and wanted to grab sort of the highlights. The first here are key findings from the remote hearings perspective. 76% of everybody who responded to the survey had a hearing during the pandemic. Most of those hearings were done fully video using Zoom. Not surprising, since we know most of the state courts are using Zoom. The respondents, most of them reported 94% that they had no issues communicating with their client during the hearing. Obviously a very good finding from our perspective. And then less than 5% of those felt that the live streaming capability altered any of the conduct of any participant. I know there were some concerns about whether or not people might act differently if they knew it was being streamed, and at least the attorneys responding and some judges responding that way did not feel that it had altered the conduct of the participants. Very glad to see this next number. 93% of everyone responding had either a positive or neutral impression of the hearing, meaning of course that 7% reported having some negative impression of the hearing, and 85% of all the respondents reported that they would recommend remote hearings to their colleagues or to clients. Not surprisingly as well, most of the respondents, the plurality I should say, feel that remote hearings are worse than in-person hearings. I think there's a natural tendency to want to be in person, but of course, you know, that's not a majority. We saw a slightly smaller number say that they felt like remote hearings were actually better than in-person hearings, and then a pretty good number of people saying that either one, basically no real difference between the two. But even though most people would prefer to be in person for their hearings, 73% of people responding to the survey felt like the hearings were effective. And then 43% of the respondents were open to conducting some portion of the jury trial remotely. Some of them were an all-out yes, we would like to do some of this remotely, and some were maybe, let's think about it. And the highest answers for what parts of the proceeding could be done remotely are listed here: juror qualification, witness testimony, voir dire. Those were the top reasons why people would do that. One question that you may be thinking is, well, is there a difference between civil and criminal and family and juvenile and probate and appellate? For the most part, there are some differences depending on the question based upon the type of practice or who you're representing. But for the most part, they're all pretty close on all of these questions. Next slide, Jesse. One of the things that we asked similarly to the potential jurors, we asked attorneys the same question about what types of steps could we take to make you feel more comfortable coming to the courthouse. And what we saw are sort of like what Carl was pointing out. Two really jumped out at the top. Really sort of all of these had, or most of these had good support, but two really jump out as kind of the key safety measures. One is having hand sanitizer available. You see the darker pink color here. Those were things, all of these numbers were the percentage of the darker color, the percentage of respondents saying that this would be absolutely necessary for them to actually come back to the courthouse. So almost half saying that they needed that to come back. Hand sanitizer, 80% saying that total they would be more likely to come. And then followed closely by temperature checks. So it's not just jurors who feel this way, it's also attorneys who feel this way. And then you can see slightly smaller numbers for face coverings, about almost 60% of all the respondents saying they felt that should be required, but 33% saying it would absolutely be necessary for them to be willing to come back to a courthouse. And then I'm not going to go through the rest of these, but you see that they drop as we go throughout the options given to them. Next slide. We also asked a question about when the attorneys felt that jury trials should resume. You see the question here. Oh, that's actually not the question. I should have fixed that. But basically, when they thought that a jury trial should resume, and you can see we gave them the choices of basically right now, summer 2020, fall 2020, early 2021, or after a vaccine was developed. You can see the number one answer amongst those was after a vaccine was developed, with 31% of the respondents indicating that's when they thought jury trials should resume, followed next by early 2021, then fall 2020, and 13% saying summer 2020. That's what the attorney said. And again, I looked specifically at this question to see if there were differences among the various types of bar, and there's very little distinction depending on what type of representation the members of the bar do. Next slide. So we're now at the point in the webinar where we can try to get to some of your questions. And so Carl and Jesse, if you could just speak a minute to how people are selected for these polls. Always the question about how they're selected and how do you make sure that there is representative, it's representative of the state. And then sort of the third part of that, rural versus urban, is this all people in the big cities? How do you make sure, how are you getting people who respond to these surveys?
So we start with a list of all registered voters across the entire state. We know the demographics of that. We know the geographic distribution. And so we make sure that our sample is similarly stratified geographically and demographically. So, obviously we're relying upon self-reporting for age, gender, ethnicity, education, questions like that, but we're also cross-referencing it with the data that is available in the voter file to make sure that it is consistent, that we're talking to the folks that we think we're talking to. So we do have a good distribution. The percentage of Texan registered voters, not all adults, but again, we're trying to replicate the jury pool as best we can. And so we included as well those with driver's licenses or state ID cards who were not registered voters, but we're really looking to replicate as best we can. So we know the percentage that come from each of the geographic areas, and the sample does reflect that. So it is actually a representative sample, again, 850 folks statewide.
And do we know, as far as some of the questions about people's feelings, Did we distinguish between whether or not they were going in for a civil trial, a criminal trial, a family trial? Did we ask any of those questions? Any differences in people's opinions about the courts based upon whether it's a civil criminal case, civil or criminal court?
We didn't. Most of our questions were actually focused on the concept of jury service rather than being party to a case. A couple of questions did relate to that, but they were very generic in nature.
And I'll also add to that that I wouldn't expect to see a lot of variation, even if we had asked people to sort of stratify which particular case type they might be dealing with. In the years that we've been doing public opinion research on this question and questions like this, we see not a lot of difference across these kinds of areas. For most people, the court system is something that they deal with occasionally, not never, but occasionally and more seldom than occasionally. And for them, the system is sort of in their mind as to what it looks like and the experience they expect to have. And just as you can't expect most people to know the difference between, a state court judge and a federal court judge, similarly, I wouldn't expect to see a lot of variation based on case type.
Carl, one of the questions, and you may need to quickly look at your data to get this one, but what percentage of people of color reported obstacles to appearing? Do you know that number?
I don't know the number. I can look it up here in a minute, but I know that it was over the 52% that was statewide. It was closer to 60%, but I can try to find an exact number there.
While you're doing that, I'll answer a question that's been tossed to me, so we'll come back to that one. But one of the questions has been asked about whether or not as you probably all know, we've been trying to conduct a couple of jury trials. The Supreme Court's order prohibited jury trials until August the 1st, at least August 1st, but then directed OCA to work with some judges to get some jury trials up and operational. We have about 10 on the schedule. We've worked with judges across the state. Almost, I think 8 of those 10 are criminal felony trials for defendants who are in jail. And we've had a couple of grand jury impanelment proceedings that have gone on. So I'm aware of 2 grand jury proceedings in East Texas and 1 jury trial, criminal jury trial. The qualification phase of that criminal jury trial was last Thursday in Bowie County, and the voir dire started yesterday. Trial started today. In Bowie County, they summoned 600 people, 128 appeared. They ended up qualifying, I think, 103. And that was a little bit lower than their normal appearance rate, but not lower. So we were able to, they were able to actually pick 2 juries out of that group that showed up. And with the grand jury proceedings that have occurred in one county, Nacogdoches County, I think about 10%, maybe even less than 10% of the people summoned showed up. That was significantly lower than their normal appearance rate. And the other county had about a little bit lower than their normal appearance rate, but not significantly. And that was Rusk County. Even though those counties are right next to each other, there was a pretty significant difference in their appearance rate. So I think the bottom line is we don't have enough data yet, but we're working to gather that over the next several weeks. That'll help us. Someone asked a question during the presentation about whether or not we had numbers about people's comfort level in appearing for jury duty, or whether they would answer whether they would appear before the pandemic. And I think the answer to that is no, we do not have that information. We do know, I know one of the judges pointed out that if 60% of the people showed up for jury duty, we would be doing really well, because that I don't think happens anywhere in the state. And so I think, Carl, that maybe is a question for you before you give us the other number. So, I know you do lots of these polls. How do you feel? We generally see anywhere between 20 and 40% show up rates normally. Well, the survey showed even in a pandemic, 60% would show up, or 68% if under certain conditions. So how do you explain that?
I explained it by the social desirability of saying, yes, I would do what I'm supposed to do. I think, again, the important thing for us is the differences between populations rather than the raw number. I think we know that 60% number is not accurate, but the groups that are more likely or less likely to appear, I think that the gaps that we see there is the real takeaway for us. And to that point, the obstacles question that we talked about earlier, there are significant differences. As I said, when we look at all communities of color, 57% say that they face one of those, at least one of those obstacles. The number is 57% also among Hispanics, 60% among African Americans, and just below 49% among whites.
Okay. I think one of the other questions that came up, Carl, was this, and I know this was asked on another webinar where you were talking about the national results, but in the list of what people's comfort level was of going and doing certain activities, jury duty, of course, is at the bottom. One of the attendees pointed out, perhaps that's because of the length of time required at jury duty versus going to the grocery store or going to a government office or voting or whatever. Do you think that has something to play into? Is that playing into the perceptions of people?
I think so. I really thought about, why the difference between going to a government office and going to the courthouse for jury duty. Technically, those shouldn't be real big differences, but I think most folks who go to a government office do it to run an errand. You go for a specific purpose, you're in, you're out. Sometimes it takes 6 hours of DMV, but you're in, you're out. It's a pretty closed-ended commitment versus jury duty, which can be much more of an open-ended commitment. So I think that explains a lot of the difference between those two measures.
So one more, maybe one more question, maybe two, if we can get to it. One of the attendees asked if we see that 68% are saying that people should be required to wear should be required to wear a mask for jury duty or at the courthouse. Why is it that we're not seeing that many people wearing it in supermarkets or other places?
I can't speak to the individual dynamics of individual stores, but certainly, people say that they should, as I said, the numbers are consistent around 70%. My own personal experience, it's closer to 100% where I live because it is required. But I think, again, there's a selectiveness to this, and some people believe that the rules apply more to others than to themselves, and we could probably come up with a lot of other examples in society where that's true. But I think overall, the belief that it should be a requirement in a large public space like a courthouse or a confined public space like a courthouse is pretty consistent.
So one final question that's going to probably cause you to have to maybe not be able to answer fully this question, but you've spoken to this a little bit, but I guess bottom line, based upon what you see in this survey and the national survey, how would you predict that the pandemic is going to affect juries? And does that, what's the impact to that overall? What should courts be thinking about, and attorneys and the public just generally?
Well, I think one is proactive communication, trying to reassure as best you can to maximize their comfort before they get there. Two is making sure that you're visibly and consistently taking steps that reflect what you've communicated to make them comfortable. The last thing you want is people getting there to start freaking out or complaining because they were told something that isn't happening. And three, I think of all the factors we've talked about, age is really going to be the biggest driver. We see dramatic differences in concern and in lifestyle consequences for older folks. And the more we learn about this disease, the more we see the disproportionate impact on those who are older. And so I think age is going to be a big driver. Race is up there, and gender as well. But I think age is probably the most important variable that has to be considered. And also, with a lot of folks still not able to report to work, it could increase participation rates among some folks who otherwise would have been too busy in their own estimation to report, but now are in a different circumstance where they're working from home or they're furloughed, unemployed, whatever it might be. You might see increased rates for some of them.
And one more question, because someone texted it to me. They're trying to go around to get it a different way. I know you mentioned this a little bit, but can you just sort of finalize here? What can we do to impact particularly people of color to appear for jury duty? What specific steps does the survey show we could do, since those are a particular group that have indicated at least they might be hesitant to appear? What does the survey show, the poll show us from that?
Well, I think it's the same thing I just said in terms of proactive communication, trying to communicate with them, whether that's through the summons, whether that's through, I know the state of Arizona was aggressive in trying to get some free media coverage of steps that they're taking and trying to send that message. There are certainly limitations to what courts can do. You don't have multi-million-dollar communications budgets, but taking advantage of whatever vehicles are there to communicate directly with folks and to be honest, I think, about the challenges and to be upfront about the fact that you're doing everything you can to make them safer.
Great. Thanks very much, Jesse and Carl. I really appreciate it. To everyone attending, we will email you a copy of these slides and a link to the actual video presentation, so you'll have access to that later. And then also, I know that there's been an application made to the bar for CLE credits, so we don't have a number for that yet, but I know that has gone in. And then finally, I would just like to stop and thank again Texaboda for their support. I know this data will be helpful to us as we look at how to get jury trials back in place, and appreciate all of you attending today. Thank you all and have a great afternoon.